Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Research Roadshow. And today we have a very special guest with us, Ms. Diane Sare and her dog Baxter in the background. And Diane is a independent candidate for Senate. She spent 34 years with the LaRouche organization, and we're very pleased to have you on. Thank you for coming, Diane.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So what is obviously the situation is not very happy, neither in the US nor in the eastern parts of Europe. What do you think are the issues that those of us who are somewhat on the right, leaning right, should be worried about today?
Well, I think the political landscape in the United States is really shifting. Lyndon LaRouche, on his 90th birthday, declared that this New Hampshire accent with a pun intended, the potty system is over. And you see that now. I mean, if a Kennedy family member who have been seen as, stalwart pillars of the Democratic Party could not even get the Democratic Party to agree to count his vote and therefore has to leave the party to become an independent, that's huge. And then you see the revolt similarly with Donald Trump still leading the pack under 91 indictments on the Republican side. And the fact that so you take that, that means the establishment, this bizarre, Roger Stone called it the duopoly or the uniparty system, whatever you want to call it, this kind of peculiar slime mold where you have Democrats calling for Liz Cheney to run for president, Victoria Nuland being like the mascot for Dick Cheney through Obama, through Biden, this blob of the Bush Clinton candidates. Sorry about my crazy dog here. At any rate, this edifice is shattering. So then you saw that Zelensky, unlike the last time when he came to the House of Representatives and was virtually, I mean, I really think he was like French kissing Pelosi. I don't know if you saw that. It was so gross. It was really horrible. On the I'm sorry. And they were holding up a flag with, Azov symbols on it. Um, it's over, and they couldn't get additional Ukraine funding in the continuing resolution through the Senate. So this is wide open, and I think that's why McCarthy has found himself out. I think we can get an enormous amount done, and I think if we can get the funding for the Ukraine war cut, we could force an end to this war before we end up with a thermonuclear annihilation.
Well, I think you're absolutely correct, and I think that more and more people who've been kind of laid back, not really into politics, are beginning to see that something is really wrong now. The guys on Wall Street have kind of pushed things too far, and this is going to, especially with the McCarthy thing going on right now, they're beginning to realize that something is really out of whack.
I think that's the case. Also, look, Americans are suffering. Uh, I have a volunteer who is trying to actually two simultaneously had their cars go kaput. So they're trying to find new used cars. You can't get a loan under 10% interest, right? The cars are unbelievably expensive. You're looking for something now that's 20 years old. I know this is the same thing in Western Europe. A study was just done in Italy about people using cars that are 10 years old and older. The car sales have dropped by about 50%. That's just a marker. So people
Mhm.
feel very, very stressed because there's no cushion. That is, a crisis happens. I forget what the numbers are, but some enormous percentage of people don't even have $500 in the bank for an emergency. So there's no give. People are on edge. And what does that lead to? Drug abuse, violence, death. Then you combine that with this flood of mass migration being brought in, I think, in such a way to be absolutely the maximum provocative possible. Um, with no plan, and you also are designing it. Americans feel hardship, and then you have places like New York City, right to shelter, which I think is true. You don't want people living on the streets, but then people are saying, "Well, I'm about to be evicted." How and you're fanning the flames of potential chaos. So I think all of these are factors. People are saying, "Well, how can we send another $26 billion to Ukraine when there are a million and one crises here in the United States that we can't even address, and when people feel like they're literally sinking, like their heads are underwater?"
Yeah, it's not just a question of the amount of money. It's that the American people are starting to feel like their European counterparts, that they have no real voice in how that money is spent. And I lived for 30 years in Italy, and people are really upset that they don't elect the people who go to Congress, the European Parliament. We elect the people who elect the people who elect the people that go to Parliament. And oddly enough, all of them, almost all of them, have a great grandfather or two that were in the upper echelons of high society, and card carrying members of the eugenics program. And now I see that America, well, certain states in America, like Michigan, are rapidly catching up into to that level of European suffering and discontent.
Yeah, I think that is the major factor. Um, and while you were thinking, I was thinking of something else. But I mean, look, and also, I know what it was. The truth about what Ukraine is has gotten out in spite of the unbelievable censorship. Almost everybody knows that there's a Nazi problem in Ukraine. You just had this horrible embarrassment in Canada with the parliament giving two standing ovations to a fellow who was with the Waffen SS. I mean, I don't know. While we didn't have nearly the number of Americans die in World War II that the Russians did or that the Soviet Union lost, nonetheless, you're really like spitting on the grave of your grandfather or father who fought in World War II if you're going to support an outright fascist, someone with blood on their hands. And I don't think it's through yet, but it was almost like a test or part of the problem that this Anglo Dutch elite has is that they actually have come to believe their own narrative. And they actually think the majority of people agree with them. And it's just not true. And I'll tell you a funny story. My husband and another organizer were out at a post office in New Jersey campaigning against funding the Ukraine war and campaigning for peace, etc. And they said 90% of the people agreed with them. Only 10% thought we had to keep supporting Ukraine. But they said the 90% believed that they were the minority and the 10% believed they were the majority. So the 10% were super arrogant, pompous, don't you know everybody? Whoa. And that was very jarring. And that's why I think we have to mobilize the Congress. We have to everyone should call their congressman. They're being told that the majority of us support funding this war, and they don't realize how angry people are about it.
Yeah, I've been largely apolitical in the U.S. because most of my energy politically is back in Europe. But now I'm going to start doing like you suggested, and calling and writing, above all, writing formal letters to my congressman here, because this is it. This is our last chance.
I think you're right. I don't think people realize how dangerous it is. I mean, the new fellow, what's his name? I keep wanting to say Schnaps, but it's not Schnapp, the new defense secretary of the UK, said, "Oh, we're going to start sending military advisors to Ukraine." And it became clear there was going to be such an explosion that Rishi Sunak, the prime minister, had to kind of walk it back, even though I think everyone knows very well there are British and American and all kinds of other NATO troops there, not only as mercenaries, but officially.
Yeah, the think tanks. The think tanks lately are doing a lot of tanking and not much thinking.
Yeah, and their tanks are getting destroyed.
Well, the one of the things talking about European armaments, I remember a couple months ago on someone's show you mentioned that your the other candidate, the incumbent, Kirsten Gillibrand, had relatives in British aerospace. Is that correct?
Yeah, her father-in-law. For a brief stint, he
Uh,
was actually the vice director or whatever you call it, of British Aerospace as a whole. I think her relatives are in it because I see the name Gillibrand if you do a search of who runs that company. And I know she got a lot of funding to keep a British aerospace plant open in Binghamton, New York.
mhm. I think that's very important because it's one thing. I, like a lot of Americans, have a little bit of heartburn with someone from the defense industry, if it's Raytheon or Lockheed, taking a government position, an elected office position. But when it's an overseas military company or an overseas foundation, that really, that's hard to take. That's hard to accept.
Yeah, she's also on the Intelligence Committee, and she was the prime sponsor, one of the prime sponsors of a bill that was so fascist and horrible. Thankfully, it never made it out of committee, called the Restrict Act, which I read, and it was so vague. It was basically, if it could be construed that you either through using technology or making statements contrary to the narrative had done anything to benefit China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, or North Korea. I'm forgetting one. Anyway, the hit parade there, that you could face up to 20 years in prison and $250,000 fine. And then the last paragraph of the act says the Freedom of Information Act does not apply. So you can be convicted, fined, and jailed and never know what you're charged with.
Wow.
Yeah, now that didn't
Holy
pass,
smoke.
but what kind of person would even sponsor such a thing?
Doesn't sound very American to me. Yeah, I'm gonna go find out who sponsored that, and I'm gonna broadcast that because
Well,
no FOIA.
Gillibrand was there were two sponsors and she was one of them. She was one of the prime sponsors, the Restrict Act.
That's incredible. That should be a real one of the cards in your deck in your hand. That's a big card.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that some of our New York subscribers were asking was about the medical situation. A lot of parents are very worried right now about these vaccine mandates and the hospital situation in general. A lot of times, and it happened to my nephew a couple years ago, where he went into the hospital and my brother and sister-in-law were told, "No, you can't. We can't tell you exactly what we're doing." That in that situation, and Merck's presence in Albany. How do you feel, or how do you think you can what you can do to improve that situation?
Well, I really think we have to have transparency on what these pharmaceutical companies are doing and what they are funding. I just read an article about a school in Maine where I, I'm not sure if she was 12 years old or I think she was 17 years old, went to a clinic, a new kind of health system they're setting up, and came home with a plastic baggie with 3 blue pills in it. They were Zoloft, and that has, like, a serious warning that they can give you suicidal ideation, and I mean, and the parents weren't informed or consulted, and the father got very angry. He said, not only were we not informed, but you send it home in a plastic baggie. We have other children in the house who are smaller. There's no warning. It's not in a medical bottle. What is this? And they have now pending legislation in California in terms of this horror that they're doing, trying to say that all ills can be changed by changing your gender. So taking children. I know a teacher that I met at the state fair. She teaches 6th grade. So what is that? 12-year-olds or yeah, 12-year-olds. And if the child comes to the teacher and says, I want you to call me by a different pronoun, and my name used to be Roberta, but now I want you to call me Robert, the teacher is not allowed to tell the parents. And so this, it is a real assault, and it's far more advanced than people realize. I think parents are naive. They presume that the point of going to school is for the child to be educated, and instead they're being destroyed. I mean, these things, you're talking about real physical um, interventions like the Zoloft case or the puberty blockers or the other things which cause harm to children, not to mention what, in my opinion, is perhaps the longer lasting, more horrible crime, which is you have a young, impressionable person who could learn to play the violin, learn 7 languages, become a new Einstein, or, you're taking the most ripe years for learning things intensely, developing a whole approach to thinking. Your curiosity about the world is alive and well, and you're taking these precious years where you could produce a whole generation of productive citizens and geniuses, and you're destroying that. You're destroying these children and destroying their lives and their future.
Well, as a father of 3 and uncle of 20, I find that abominable. That is where, if I would be spending a lot more time getting in the face of my elected representatives and the school board officials and finding out exactly what kind of game we're playing here. Because, at least here in Ohio, we pay quite a penny for our schools.
I think that's the case everywhere. I mean, really, people aren't paying for their schools. Here in New York, property taxes are outrageous. People are leaving the state in record numbers. But if you look at the shape of the roads of the schools, the money's clearly not going there. It's going to bail out some Wall Street hedge fund, Jeffrey Epstein, former partner, something like that.
Yeah, that's really out of hand. The and how is it just in New York, or are there other states doing the same kind of thing?
You mean on this transgender sex change
Right.
business? Many states now, there's beginning to be a revolt, and even in countries like Sweden, which were very liberal promoting it, there was the case of one girl, and there turned out to be many, who was trying to transition to be a boy, and the puberty blockers and other hormones, because they induce menopause early, caused this girl to develop severe osteoporosis. And she ended up in the hospital with all kinds of hairline fractures and excruciating pain. And so Sweden concluded that maybe you shouldn't do this so young, and et cetera. They began pushing back. North Carolina, the assembly was able to pass legislation overriding the governor to make it. And some of these things you say, why do we need legislation? You can't teach sex ed before, from kindergarten to 4th grade, no sex ed. If a child comes in saying something like this, the parents have to be informed. Doctors are not allowed to perform sex altering surgery on minors. I mean, these are things that you would think. When I started reading what was going on in the schools, I thought this is like Mengele and the Nazi concentration camps, what they're doing, because the people who go through this are in pain for the rest of their lives. They have all kinds of horrible medical complications. And the people who regret it and want to reverse it, who are blackballed and silenced, right? Because there's a huge push on this, um, are really ostracized, and it's evil. So I don't know. California is very far gone, as is New York and other states. I think Massachusetts is pretty bad. Maine is pretty bad. Pennsylvania, I know cases in Pennsylvania of parents having to intervene very, very gingerly because they will take your children away. So your son or daughter comes home and says, well, I think I'm really a girl, or I think I'm really a boy, and that's not how they were born. You cannot use a heavy-handed approach. And in California right now, apparently there's legislation pending to allow 12-year-olds, starting at age 12, children to declare that their parents are harming their development and become wards of the state.
That is unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. I know that 40 years ago, my grandfathers would not have accepted anything like this. They would have gotten together and done something.
I know. It's so horrible. I was so gut-wrenched. I've been reading a book by Dr. Miriam Grossman, a child psychiatrist from California, called Lost in Transnation. And I tried to read some excerpts to my husband, and he said, "Would you please stop? I'm about to commit an act of violence against someone. Don't read it out loud anymore." It's horrible.
It is getting worse and worse and worse. But this brings me back to one of the topic that close to my heart, and that is the ability to communicate, the ability to connect with other people, to tell them, hey, knock on your neighbor's door and say, we've got to go downtown and talk to the mayor. We've got to do something. The ability to connect and to speak your mind to your neighbor is being heavily infringed upon. I tried to play the video of you and Scott Ritter from a few days ago, and my browser would not let me unmute the tab.
Wow.
And I could play any other YouTube video, but not that one.
Wow, that's interesting because my views have really plummeted, and I definitely have the sense I'm being shadow banned, but you can't measure it unless people give you these reports. And some people have been private messaging me on Facebook saying, I used to see your videos all the time. Now I can't get them, or now I can't open them, or now I can't share them. So you're right. That's why we have to be in the streets. That's why I started an actual hard print newspaper to try and cut through that kind of censorship.
And so where can people subscribe to that print newspaper?
Well, they can sign up on my website at sareforsenate.com, SAREFOR, Senate.com, and people can donate. I can't sell things, but you can make a donation to the campaign if you want copies of the paper. The PDFs of the paper are all available on the website, sareforsenate.com. I do, just in closing, I really want to stress what I said at the beginning, which is we are in a revolutionary period. So if you've been hopeless or despondent or decided your voice doesn't make a difference, thank you. That's exactly it. It does right now. It really does. They have lost their grip. They wouldn't have to do. Why do they have to censor me? I'm not a multimillionaire. I don't own British Aerospace, or, my campaign is probably has about less than 1% of the money that Kirsten Gillibrand's campaign has. So what is the big threat? Because these ideas are resonating right now. The Democratic Party is, has been hoisted by its own petard, or whatever you want to say. They are done, really. They thought that, I don't know what they thought Bobby Kennedy was going to do, just give up, or what, I don't know. Cut a deal like Bernie Sanders did, maybe. So we are in the most incredible moment in history. We could go back to our constitutional founding principles, turn on a dime like China did, eradicate poverty in a very few years, see a massive improvement in the standard of living, the purchasing power of the dollar, and life expectancy. We could choose to do that. And now is the time, and it's important to get active. And I think the first flank is cut off the money to Ukraine. Cut it off. Without our money, that war would be over in about 3 days. You're still muted, John.
Exactly. And we have to push the Fortune 500, who are making a huge profit off of the war. We have to put pressure on them. We have to do a boycott, but a serious boycott this time.
Yeah, well, I think we should demand that all of the Congress be audited. No one in Congress should be allowed to have shares that they're actively trading when they're making I mean, this is so unbelievable, isn't it? The things you
It
have
is.
to say, it's really, you'd think they'd be obvious, so we're gonna have
Yeah.
to say them and fight for them.
We thought things were bad in Europe, but our Congress is getting worse and worse.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again, Diane. I really appreciate you coming on. This is information that everyone needs to know, not just in New York, but around the U.S. And hopefully, we'll be able to get some of our subscribers behind your campaign.
Great. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great day.
Yep, you too.
See you, everybody. See you tomorrow for the George Webb special.